The biomechanical failure. The collapse of Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell at 3:47 p.m. was more than a medical emergency. It was a visible manifestation of institutional atrophy. For 4 decades, McConnell operated as the ultimate legislative architect, a man whose pulse seemed synchronized with the gavel of the Senate. Why, then, did the most disciplined man in Washington lose his poker face only when his heart began to fail? The answer lies in the psychological weight of a systemic fracture he could no longer bridge. McConnell's career was defined by strategic ambiguity and the McConnell Doctrine, a ruthless utilization of judicial fast-tracking to ensure judicial hegemony. He spent years engineering a 6-3 conservative majority, viewing the courts as a long-term hedge against a changing electorate. However, as his knees buckled on the Senate floor, the fragility of this transactional hegemony became undeniable. He had built a fortress of judges, yet found himself trapped in a party that had traded its institutional soul for a personality cult. The technical precision he once brought to the floor was replaced by a visceral, biological protest. His final words, "We lost control," were not a plea for medical intervention. They were a cold, surgical coroner's report for the Republican establishment. The Mansfield Room, silence. Inside the Mansfield Room, the silence following McConnell's fall was heavy with the scent of a brewing succession crisis. This secure space, designed to protect the caucus from the prying eyes of the press, could not shield it from the reality of its own obsolescence. Can a secure room actually protect a party from the fact that its leader has admitted to a total loss of power dynamics? As the Grim Reaper lay unconscious, the mechanical reality of Senate Rule 99 and the internal hierarchy of the Three Johns faced an immediate insurgent threat. The tactical capitulation of the past decade had finally reached its terminal phase. Even as medical professionals stabilized his vitals, a macroeconomic volatility began to ripple through the room. Senators like Rick Scott and Ted Cruz did not just see a fallen colleague. They saw a vacancy in the institutional guardrails. The secret ballot, once a tool for party discipline, now stood as a compromised mechanism, vulnerable to a political risk premium imposed by outside activists. The race to fill the vacuum began before the ambulance doors even closed, signaling that the era of rational actor Republicanism was over. The stretcher carried away more than a man. It carried away the last vestige of the old guard, the architecture of the Grim Reaper. How do you build a 40-year career on the power of no, only to realize you can't say it to your own base? Mitch McConnell was never a populist. He was a master of the nuclear option, a procedural high explosive he detonated to dismantle the filibuster for judicial nominees. This was not chaos. It was a tactical capitulation to the reality of a gridlocked Senate. By reducing the confirmation threshold to a simple majority, he transformed the upper chamber into a high-speed conveyor belt for the Federalist Society. McConnell understood that in an era of institutional atrophy, legislative victories are fleeting, but life-tenured judges are a permanent hedge. He played the long game, using strategic ambiguity to keep his caucus in line while he reshaped the American legal landscape. Yet this very architecture, designed to protect conservative interests from a Democratic majority, became the cage that trapped him. He provided the tools for a movement that eventually viewed his discipline as a barrier to its own radical impulses. He built the machine, but as he stood on that floor, he realized the controls had been rewired. The Reaper found himself in the harvest he had spent decades sowing. The debt ceiling detonator is a sovereign default risk, a viable political strategy, or a form of national suicide. To understand the current crisis, one must look at the Second Liberty Bond Act of 1917. Originally a tool to give the Treasury flexibility during World War I, it has been mutated into a mechanism for fiscal extortion. In the 2026 landscape, the debt ceiling is no longer a routine adjustment. It is a detonator held by a faction that views the global financial system as collateral. Trump's demand to withhold the debt limit increase unless federal prosecutions are abandoned is a direct assault on the concept of a rational actor. This is not a negotiation over spending. It is an attempt to use the credit of the United States to buy individual legal immunity. The macroeconomic volatility triggered by this standoff has already forced a political risk premium onto U.S. Treasuries. Global markets, once reliant on the predictability of the American adults in the room, are now pricing in the possibility of a manufactured catastrophe. The debt ceiling hasn't just been reached, it has been weaponized. Appropriations as a weapon of war. Can the power of the purse be used to legally execute a coup against the rule of law? Under Article 1, Section 9, the Constitution is clear. No money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. Traditionally, this was the ultimate check on executive overreach. However, in the hands of a fractured GOP, it has become a tool for a surgical deconstruction of the Department of Justice. By attaching riders to essential funding bills, the MAGA wing is attempting to defund specific investigations, effectively using the appropriations weaponization mechanism to veto the executive branch's constitutional duty to enforce the law. This creates a lethal paradox. The legislature is using its most fundamental power to prevent the execution of justice. This isn't just a budget fight. It's a constitutional crisis being fought in the fine print of a continuing resolution. As McConnell collapsed, he was in the middle of explaining that this path leads to electoral disaster. He knew that once you stop paying the bills to protect a single man, you aren't a political party anymore. You are a defense team with a seat in the Senate, the succession shadow war. The race to succeed McConnell is not a polite transition. It is a primal struggle for the survival of institutionalism itself. In a party increasingly defined by the three Johns, Thune, Cornyn, and Barrasso, the shadow of Mar-a-Lago looms larger than any Senate seniority. John Thune, the quintessential McConnell acolyte, represents the final stand for the adults in the room, but his past votes for certification and criticisms of election denialism have rendered him a marked man in the eyes of the movement. Why is the outsider the only one everyone is actually watching? Because the vanguard of vulnerability has shifted the goalposts. Rick Scott's immediate positioning as the change candidate is a calculated play for the transactional hegemony of the MAGA base. In this vacuum, the succession crisis becomes a referendum on loyalty over legislative skill. Every Republican senator is now forced into a surgical deconstruction of their own political identity. Do they align with Thune's traditional conservatism, or do they bend to the insurgent demand for a leader who treats the Senate as a mere subsidiary of the executive? The successor won't lead a unified caucus. They will merely curate the fragmentation of a party whose center has officially collapsed. The institutionalists' epitaph. If the most effective Republican in history failed to contain Trumpism, was it ever actually controllable? Mitch McConnell's 40-year tenure was an exercise in tactical capitulation disguised as strategic mastery. He allowed the populist fire to burn, believing he could harness its heat to power his judicial assembly line. But as the Grim Reaper lay on the floor, the epitaph for his era was already being written in the silence of his colleagues. McConnell's admission that we lost control marks the terminal phase of the rational actor theory in American politics. He operated under the assumption that power could be managed through rules, norms, and strategic ambiguity. He was wrong. The movement he helped nourish did not want his discipline. It wanted his infrastructure to facilitate its own systemic fracture. By 2026, the Republican Party has ceased to be a deliberative body and has morphed into a vessel for a single man's grievances. McConnell's collapse was the physical breaking point of a man who realized that the machine he built had not just been hijacked, it had been repurposed to dismantle the very institutions he spent his life defending. The global risk premium. Why is a 12-minute ambulance ride in D.C. causing interest rate tremors in Tokyo and London? Because McConnell was the last bridge between the GOP and the post-WIA liberal order. His exit creates a geopolitical void that no amount of diplomatic flattery can fill. For decades, the Senate acted as the institutional guardrails for NATO and global trade. With McConnell diminished, the world is pricing in a political risk premium on the American security guarantee. The macroeconomic volatility we are witnessing is the sound of global capital fleeing towards stability. Investors are no longer just tracking inflation or Fed rates. They are tracking the health of a man who represented the last vestige of American predictability. In the 2026 landscape, a Trumpified Senate leadership means a shift toward isolationism and the appropriations weaponization of foreign aid. Allies in Europe and Asia now face a governance deficit in Washington that renders the U.S. an unreliable partner in the face of Russian aggression or Chinese expansion. The adults in the room haven't just left. They've been carried out on stretchers, leaving the global market to grapple with an America that is increasingly a predatory rogue actor in its own alliances. The cult versus the caucus. The transformation is complete. At what point does a political party stop being an organization and start being a mirror for one man's ego? The Senate floor collapse of Mitch McConnell was not the cause, but the final public symptom of a systemic fracture that has been metastasizing for a decade. The Republican caucus, once a bastion of institutional weight, has been hollowed out by a personality cult that prioritizes loyalty over legislative efficacy. This shift has rendered the traditional suburban pivot, McConnell's preferred method for securing a general election, mathematically extinct. By 2026, the GOP no longer possesses the internal institutional guardrails necessary to separate party interests from the whims of a single candidate. Every vote is now a binary choice: total fealty or political exile. This environment creates a permanent state of macroeconomic volatility as the party's direction changes with every Truth Social post. The few remaining moderates are no longer participants in a coalition. They are hostages in a hijacked vehicle. 2024 was never going to be a simple election. It was a stress test for a constitutional system that is currently showing terminal hairline fractures. The caucus is no longer a deliberative body. It is a satellite office. The 2026 horizon is the fall of Mitch McConnell the end of an era or the beginning of a total institutional reboot? As we gaze into the 2026 horizon, the landscape is defined by institutional atrophy. The Grim Reaper served as the last dampener on the populist surge, his presence providing a veneer of stability that global markets desperately craved. Without him, the political risk premium on American leadership has become a permanent tax on the national interest. The silence from Mar-a-Lago in the wake of his collapse is not an oversight. It is a declaration of total, uncontested victory over the old guard. The geopolitical implications are existential. The world is watching a superpower succumb to sovereign default risk, not because of a lack of resources, but because of a total failure of power dynamics. If the most effective political operator in modern history admitted to losing control, we must accept that the American machine is running on an unmonitored autopilot. The shift toward a fully Trumpified Senate suggests a future of isolationist trade wars and the appropriations weaponization of global security. We are witnessing the sunsetting on the institutionalist dream, replaced by a horizon where the only law is the leader's latest grievance. The era of the rational actor is dead. The era of the vengeance actor has begun.